Good morning, Anthony.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm great. It's nice to see you today. I'm grateful for you joining Michelle's Conversations That Matter. Thank you.
Oh, it is truly my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Of course. What I'm doing with my series, Michelle's Conversations That Matter, is I'm out to cause more open conversation about mental health by bringing in experts like yourself, bringing in clinicians, storytellers to really humanize the conversation around mental health and have us have a healthier relationship to the brain. So, and I'm grateful that I met you through a mutual friend. And I'm inspired by the great work that you're doing in the workplace around grief. So let's dive right in. If you would, please just introduce yourself to my audience. Let them know who you are, where you live, and what you do.
Sure. Anthony Casablanca, I live in a little tiny town in Indiana called Batesville, Indiana. Ironically, it's home to two New York Stock Exchange traded companies, Hillenbrand and Hillrom. And so that makes up most of the town, frankly. There's only about 6,000 folks in our town. So it's a tiny little town in southeastern Indiana. Um, and actually, I spent my career working with Hillenbrand as a senior executive. And here just a few years ago, my brother and I decided. My brother is a licensed funeral director, and we saw a real need here in tackling grief from a little bit different perspective than most people think about it. And so that's what led us to writing the book and starting our consulting company.
That's amazing. So your brother has an entirely different perspective on grief, just being in the profession that he's in.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, I'm sure he sees a lot of pain. That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's amazing as we started to reflect back as we wrote the book, The Dying Art of Leadership. It's amazing how much grief we encountered in the workplace,
Yeah.
and really that's what led to our work.
I think about this pandemic, Anthony, and I have to say that even just over the past 2 weeks, I have either known someone who's passed away or I know someone who's mourning the loss of someone. And this is just recently, like this is the past 2 weeks, but this has been going on ever since the pandemic started, what, 9 months ago now?
Right.
So we're losing so many people. It's almost naive to think that not one of us has been affected by loss or death during the pandemic. And it's not normal, the times that we're living in. So can you take a moment before we dive into the impact of grief on people? Tell us why this is so important to you. Why do you do the work that you do? Why is it so personal?
Yeah. So as I alluded to, my brother and I both realized just how much we have been impacted by grief personally and in the workplace. And one of the things that we strive to do in the book um, is to elevate people's definition of grief, right? Because it's not just the loss of a loved one. Any emotionally traumatic event can create the patterns of grief in someone's life or can cause them to grieve. And so, when you couple that definition with what's going on with the pandemic, and then you throw on top of that organizations are trying to return to pre-pandemic profit levels, and so they're doing all kinds of cost-cutting measures and slashing people's benefits and layoffs and all of that. It just compounds, right? So you have people who are grieving the loss of a loved one. You have people who are scared to death about there's now been, some newscasts about another strain of the virus that showed up in Europe. And, my kids are home and I don't know when they're going back to school. And my wife lost her job and we need the second income. And my company is slashing benefits. And it just gets overwhelming to people. And so, we decided that you could either point the finger and tell people they should just suck it up and get over it, or we could help leaders understand how they could play a part in actually helping grieving employees excel at work.
I'm going to play a cynical leader here and
Okay.
and just sort of get because I know people are thinking that who might be watching, right? Is it my responsibility as a leader to care about your grieving situation, or is it my responsibility as a leader to just make sure that we meet our deliverables? Because
Right.
because there is that old mentality, right?
Right.
You know, I'm from a different school, but what's your reaction to that? Like, we just need to get the work done. I don't have time for this.
Yeah, yeah. So our reaction to that is that is unfortunately probably the most common response or reaction.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't know that it's necessarily the leader's fault. We as a society don't deal well with grief. Organizations don't deal well with grief, and there's literally no training out there. I don't care how prestigious a school you go to, no leader is trained on how to deal with grief in the workplace. And so the response, while it's unfortunate, is probably more natural than not, because it's just been the way we've been conditioned.
Yep.
But whether or not it is a leader's responsibility, there's been some studies done that show that grief in the workplace, defined broadly as we've defined it, costs organizations $75 billion a year. And that study was done long before COVID was ever a word.
How does it cost in disability costs?
Well, so it costs in productivity, right? Because as you said, right, I can barely bring myself to come to work, right?
Yeah.
And so people are distracted. There's safety issues. There's errors. They're just glancing off into space. They're not productive, right? They can't concentrate.
Yeah.
And the leader who ignores that and waits for performance to slip and then starts to deal with the performance just compounds the problem, right? And so now the person's even more distracted and they're even more frustrated. And that person either winds up leaving the organization on their own because they realize this isn't the kind of company I want to work for, or they get pushed out of the organization through their leader managing their performance, or worse, they stay and they never feel the same about the company again. And so you start to lose that discretionary effort and the loyalty and the engagement of the person. But it's a big issue. I mean,
or
one in 4 people are likely.
Sorry to interrupt you. Or what about they hit crisis and have to go out on disability?
Yes, right. Because an emotional, nothing could be worse than a significant illness diagnosis, which requires all kinds of things to happen, right? And a lot of people try to push through that because they're afraid of what will happen with, one of the most shocking things, our son was diagnosed with cancer a couple of years ago, and I was dumbfounded. The nurse made the comment to me, she would always ask my son, how is work going? And he was very fortunate. He worked for a company that had a pretty progressive leave policy or vacation policies. And she said, man, you have no idea the number of people who not only have to fight cancer, but they have to worry about losing their job. And that's just tragic. That's just tragic.
How's your son now?
Thank you for asking. He's doing well. He's coming up on 2 years cancer free. So that's all good. But yeah.
Awesome. So why do leaders need to pay attention to this? Because I know that, we just walked through a scenario that's more common than not. But, I think in this day and age, why do we need to shake the tree and get leaders to realize that they need to pay attention to grieving employees?
Well, there's the statistics, right? It's likely that some studies show as many as 1 in 4 employees show up to work in some state of grief. $75 billion a year in lost productivity. So from a business standpoint, leaders should just flat out pay attention to this, right? Because that's a lot of money. And those numbers are all pre-COVID, right? It's probably in excess of $100 billion now. And then there's just the human side of the business, right? You never really, there's the old saying, no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care, right? And that's such a big piece of leadership. And when I'm ever coaching leaders, I tell them that, you know, first you care, then you lead. If you do it the other way around, you'll have direct reports, but you'll never have followers.
Yeah.
And so, you know, when you're looking to build trust and engagement and loyalty,
Yeah.
you know, if you don't have compassion and you don't have the courage to be vulnerable and to engage with the employee in these situations,
Mm-hmm.
you're never really leading.
You know, I think that leaders, and this has a lot to do with leaders being self-aware and leaders being having empathy and compassion for themselves, right? But when I reflect on the leaders who I've had, it's those leaders who have extended their heart to me first that I have wanted to work 150% for. Right. But you know, there are leaders out there who just don't find it the place for them to do that. And that's so unfortunate, because you can literally motivate someone simply by extending your hand and your heart to them. Right. You know, it's a win-win. You know, if you feel cared for as an employee, I'm a human being and then I'm an employee number. Like, wow. I mean, you could honestly help the well-being and the productivity of the company at the same time.
Right. Absolutely. But two things happen in those situations. One, the organizations probably never really set the expectation that that's how they want people to lead, regardless of the flowery words they have in their vision statements and those kinds of things. At the end of the day, if you start all conversations with metrics and spreadsheets, you quickly send a message to leaders that that other stuff doesn't matter. Right. And then leaders have never been trained on how to deal with this. Because it is an awkward, emotional, uncomfortable time. It's a huge leadership challenge, and nobody really offers any counsel to leaders on how to deal with this, at least until now.
Yeah, you know, I think about my time in the corporate space and how, you know, there was always the what, the performance piece of your job, and then there was the how you achieved that piece of performance, right? And I think that we are living in a society where performance is what's rewarded, right? So if you're a leader, you're being measured on your performance versus the how, right? Where I think the how is, if not more important, because that cultivates community and connection and motivation and loyalty within your team. So it's interesting. Maybe there's something that needs to be done around, yes, performance is important, but how you're achieving that performance is even more important if you're trying to cultivate and maintain good employees.
Right. And, you know, what we're really talking about here is just creating a culture of sort of emotional well-being and emotional safety, right? A culture where somebody feels comfortable enough to raise their hand. Yeah. Say, hey, I'm struggling. Help me deal with this. And helping them deal with that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to help them through their cancer, right? What it does mean is give me some space, help me with my work stress so I can deal with my personal stress. Yeah. That's really what we're talking about here, right? We're not talking about turning leaders into grief counselors. We're not talking about turning leaders into psychiatrists or psychologists. We're really just talking about leaders learning how to adapt their leadership style to give their people the space. And in doing so, you actually make the entire team more productive, as counterintuitive as that may sound. But we're not talking about, you know, some touchy-feely topic here, right? We're talking about putting people first, but accomplishing the mission always, right? Yeah. Because that is what we're supposed to do as leaders, and that is what organizations do. But we should never, those two should never be separated, right? It should never be all about the mission and not about the people. It's people first, mission always. And there are ways that those two things can come together.
So I'm going to play the devil's advocate here. I'm an employee and I'm struggling. I've just lost a loved one. My husband has lost his job. Like, I'm feeling pretty depressed. And and I have an insensitive leader. I have a leader. There's no way I can tell my leader what I'm dealing with. I just have to keep my head down and do the best I can, but I'm distracted. What can employees do? Like, what can employees do to get support from their leader if they feel like their leader is just an insensitive, not nice person?
Yeah. So that is a really tough one, right? It's one thing if your leader maybe doesn't know what to do but cares. That's a different conversation, right? That's one where the employee could go to the leader and say, "Hey, I'm struggling. Can we talk about this?"
That takes something, but that takes something, Anthony. Like, that really takes something,
Yes.
you know?
Yes, it does. It does. Um, you know, so I'll give you an example of, I just had this conversation with a group from hospice, and the nurses sort of take it amongst themselves to work through grief by sharing within their own little team.
Oh.
And so, the people around you want to help. They just don't know how, right? And that's why you get all of those false platitudes about, if there's anything you need, just let me know.
Yeah.
Which is such a veil thing.
Yeah.
But if there's somebody on your team that you can confide in and talk to about what you're dealing with and maybe what help you need,
Yeah.
The folks at hospice go so far as to be very sensitive to, wow, you've just had a string of patients that, are at this stage or went through this. I've got some patients that aren't that far along. How about we swap patients so that you're not dealing with grief upon grief upon grief, and I'll take this patient from you.
Wow.
They do that amongst themselves because the leaders there, I don't know how far removed they are, but there really isn't a mechanism within the leadership of hospice, apparently, or not very many of them, to deal with that. So the employees deal with it themselves, right?
Yeah.
And they help each other through their tough times.
Yeah.
I mean, that is an avenue.
That's powerful. Listen, when I was in my Fortune 50 company, we did the same thing. We had an employee resource group for mental health, and there was a grief subgroup, and that grief subgroup was there for that very reason. If I knew a colleague of mine was struggling with something, I could connect them to the grief subgroup, and then it was peer on peer support, right? But I think that there's a fundamental challenge with people not wanting to be vulnerable at work, right? You want to show up as strong. You want to show up as a competent, effective. You don't want to be looked over for an opportunity or a project. So it's hard. I think cultures are really where we need to start looking at at different cultures and saying, what is working in this culture and what could we make even stronger to support our people?
Right.
Yeah.
And it takes so one of the things my brother and I have recognized with our leadership training company is there's a lot of companies who just aren't ready for this.
Right.
And so we're looking for the select few who get it and realize that they've not ever talked to their leaders about this.
Yeah.
Even though they may have made all kinds of changes to leave policies and flexible work policies, and they've aligned all of the policies.
Yeah.
Until you've actually talked to your leaders, all of that sort of gets muted. One of the things that every single person that we talked to in researching our book, every single person ended their story with the exact same sentence. And that was, but if I worked for a different leader, I don't know if I would have been treated the same way. Right. And so that speaks to this need for organizations to recognize that maybe they've not done enough to set the expectation around this topic.
I think there are things about the pandemic that do give me hope. I feel like there is a silver lining. I feel like, mental imbalance is becoming more and more prevalent. People are like struggling. It's not normal for us to be quarantined and isolated from our friends and family. Connection is so important. So what scares me in the beginning of your statement was, not all the companies are ready for this. You know what? Like, after this pandemic, every company is going to have had employees affected by loss. It's inevitable. Like, you sort of want to shake them and go, get on board, get on board. This is affecting your people.
Right.
But I want to go back to the title of this episode, Helping Grieving Employees Excel. So I struggled with putting that in writing, because I said to myself, when you're grieving, you're just trying to hold it together. You're just trying to keep yourself afloat. How is it, Anthony, that we can help grieving employees actually excel?
Right. So I could give you a couple of examples. One is actually in the book. We actually took the title of the book from the example that this woman shared, and I won't go into detail. So I won't. No spoiler alert here. I won't share her story here, but she's in chapter 8 of the book, and her name is Becky, and she shared an amazing story about how when she went through her husband's fatal cancer diagnosis, how her company stepped up, and her closing comment to me was, they didn't just treat me well, they actually helped me excel at work while I was grieving.
Wow.
So hold that story aside so your readers can read that. I have another one.
The book. Anthony, give us the name of the book. Plug the book real quick.
The book is The Dying Art of Leadership: How Leaders Can Help Grieving Employees Excel at Work.
Awesome. I'll put that in the notes. Go ahead.
Cool. So there's another gentleman that I mentor. I've known him for quite a while, and his wife has been struggling with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer for the last 5 years. And he happened to work for a leader who gets it, right? He just sort of intuitively leads from his heart. And so this individual felt comfortable enough to go into his boss and share the situation with him. Actually, when this started, he was working for a female. And so he went into her and shared the situation. And then later, that individual moved on to another role, and he was working for somebody else. The long story short is, A, he felt comfortable enough to share it with his boss. And B, his boss was vulnerable enough to recognize that he was part of the aftercare portion of the support network, right? And so whenever things got hairy, whenever things changed, this boss was very much open. They would have lots of conversations, and they literally, over the last 5 years, kept this individual not only as a high performer, but they kept them as a high potential, even with all of the restrictions that his wife's illness brought to bear on the situation. So, they did things to, and I think you've frozen up on me here because you're not moving. But they did things to help him with, even though he couldn't travel and even though he couldn't take other assignments, they sort of brought the experiences to him. They reallocated some of his projects and some of his resource requirements. And he was able to just manage his way through that. We lost the connection. What do we do?
I'm sorry. All right, here we go.
Okay.
All right. So, sorry. Okay. So this is live TV for anyone who's watching. This is what happens. I just have to laugh through it. Anthony's laughing with me. This is the way it is. So I apologize. Yep. But you were talking about the story of your the colleague who had a husband with cancer.
No, his wife had stage 4 metastatic.
Wait, okay, go ahead.
Right, and so he was able to go in and talk to his boss, and basically, I'm not sure where the story cut off, but through talking to his boss, they were able to keep him not only high performing, but also as a high potential, and they did that by flexing his projects and his responsibilities. They actually promoted him during this process and gave him more responsibility. But then when things got, hairy and treatments got more involved and there were more side effects and he had to be more present, they would take some responsibilities and give it to other members of the team. And even though this person couldn't travel and couldn't take on other responsibilities, broader responsibilities, they brought the experiences to him.
Got it.
It was actually quite an amazing story. But even he ended the story by saying, but if I worked for a different leader, I don't know if I'd have been treated the same way.
Isn't it? It all comes down to our immediate leader and how that interaction is. It's so important. I think about like the loss of my parents, like when I lost my mother and when I lost my father and the grieving that I was going through during that time. And I also think about how I look to work as an escape. Like I wanted to work because it helped me. It actually, working can help people work through instead of sitting at home, because listen, I sat home and I cried for weeks, and that helped me get to a point where I was like, okay, now I need to work, because wrapping my head around something helped me. So it's like creating that space in the workplace where people can come and they can work and they're cared for. It could be a win-win, right?
Yes. Because that's what we're talking about, is giving folks the space they need while they're at work, right? If you're returning to work and your boss is just beating you up because of whatever, right? That doesn't help. But if you return to work and there is an environment of, hey, when I'm struggling, I can come in and talk to you and say, hey, I just need a little space here. Can we make some adjustments because I'm struggling? I don't know. I'm just going through a tough period. When that happens, then employees can actually excel at work. You can manage your way through it all. And frankly, leaders, although this sounds like, a double-edged sword, leaders need to be very cognizant of folks who throw themselves into their work and start working, become workaholics, because that's actually could be a sign of denial. And things could come crashing down in a really big way. If that's the case. And in those situations, there you want to just make sure that the employee understands that there are some employee assistance benefits that with counseling and those kinds of things. But no, if a leader is willing to help the employee strike that balance, and that's really what we're talking about, then the employee can excel at work.
Doesn't it all come down to the emotional intelligence of a leader?
It does, as well as the training. Right. So it's one thing to know you should care. It's another thing to know how to engage in those conversations, and what to do when you do engage in those conversations. But it is very much about emotional intelligence, right? And how sensitive, especially now in the virtual world, right? It takes a whole lot of emotional intelligence to be able to pick up on the nonverbal cues that when somebody tells you they're fine, but they're really not. Right? That's a little hard to do in the thumbnail pictures that you get on a Zoom video conference.
I know, yeah.
So, yes.
And fine, like you said, like being willing to kind of, it's so frustrating when someone says, when someone, you hear the word fine, I'm fine.
Right.
It's like, really? Like, I think an emotionally intelligent or trained leader knows that fine might not be the truth, right? It's the connection, it's building the trust, it's it's checking in frequently, but yet not being invasive. It's just being tuned in, right?
Right. Right. Yeah. Just one of the readers of our book and a person who follows grief leaders, I just had a conversation with her. She was a medical billing clerk. And it never dawned on me, but those folks actually develop relationships with their patients because they see the billings coming through over and over and over and over again for for the same people. And her boss would ask them, and of course they're all working from home now, but her boss would always ask, "How are you doing?" But it was always at the beginning of the meeting, and then she quickly moved on to the first agenda topic, or it was at the end of the meeting after everybody had been on the phone for 2 hours and nobody wanted to keep talking. And so everybody would say, "We're fine."
Fine.
However, they were all spending time in their home offices crying during the day. And the leader never knew that. And it was all because of the way she asked the question, didn't leave the space. It was very apparent, it was very transparent to people that she was asking the question, but she didn't really want the answer.
You didn't want the answer, yeah.
Right. And that's the art of leadership, right? That is the dying art of leadership, is to learn how to ask those questions and how to engage the employee so that you know they're not fine. So just tell them that. Yeah. Start the conversation with, "I know we're not fine. Here's what I'm struggling with," right? Or in the case of the loss of a loved one, I don't know how you could possibly balance all of this. Just know that we want to help. So let's talk a little bit about how you're feeling, what you're doing, right? All of those things sort of set a different tone than just saying, "How you doing?"
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And there is nothing better than feeling heard and feeling cared for.
Right. Which is what most people, that is the biggest, that gets you 80% of the way there, is to just know you can talk about it and that it's okay to raise your hand when you're struggling. Every single person that we talked to either said, "I was so glad I was able to talk about this at work because it relieved a lot of stress," or they said, "I wish I would have been able to talk about this at work because it would have made it so much easier to deal with," regardless of what their situation was.
Right. How do you help people, Anthony? Tell us about how you, with the work you're doing, and how are you helping leaders in the workplace? Tell us about your work.
Sure. So trying to condense down 8 hours of training. So there's lots of principles in the book, and folks can read the book, but obviously you can only get so much out of the book. You have to experience some of this. And so we engage organizations and sort of put leaders through an experiential leadership training program that covers all of the concepts in the book. But basically, the three things that we really, I guess there's really four things that we try to bring out in the training and in the book. One is that the leaders need to engage the employee in the grief process, right? Mm-hmm. And again, grief defined very broadly, because your company's own initiatives can cause people to grieve, right? So engage in the process, have the conversation, even though it's so awkward and emotional and it's going to be uncomfortable, but that's all okay, right? Mm-hmm. Then adjust your leadership style, because it doesn't do any good to have that conversation, and when it's all done, go, "Okay, well, good chat, suck it up. You have a big deadline." That's right. That just negates everything you tried to do, right? So in working with the employee, this is not a one-sided thing. This isn't a, "Hey, I think it would be best for you if we did this," right? It's a, "Hey, let's talk about, what do you think we could do to help you through this? What kind of support do you need? Here's what I'm thinking. What do you think?" And then involve the team, which is one that every leader seems to overlook because they get all caught up in the privacy.
Yes, I was just going to say, yeah.
Yeah, so you don't have to go in and tell the team that, "Hey, John needs some help because his wife is in stage 4 metastatic breast cancer, and here's all the details of her treatment." You don't have to reveal all of that. All you have to do is say, "John and his family are going through a really tough time right now. And, he's asked me not to share the details, but we could really help John if we could do these things, because he's going to need time off and he's going to need whatever. And so John and I have talked, and here's how we'd like you guys to help support him through this time, so that he doesn't feel the stress of, things slipping here at work while he does the right thing and helps his family or whatever the case might be. And then the fourth one is be vulnerable, right? Because if the leader is vulnerable, it makes the rest of this a heck of a lot easier, right? And being vulnerable is admitting that I don't even know what to tell you, right? It's that discussion, right? It's I can't even imagine what you're going through. Boy, with all that's going on in the work environment, I know I'm struggling with these things. You guys have to be struggling. Talk to me, right? That's the attitude a leader needs to approach this with. So those are the four things that, if we were going to give folks tips right here on this call, go do. But there's 8 hours of engaging training that go with that to teach leaders how to do this.
Anthony, I think every organization needs to be ringing your phone off the hook for support, because everybody is affected, and we're not expected to be going back into a workplace anytime soon. So you have isolated employees struggling through grief. So I think that you should be service, for every organization to help employees navigate the pandemic and the loss of their loved ones and their loss of whatever they're having to let go of. So you're amazing with the work you're doing. Any final words of wisdom you want to leave with the folks who have joined us today?
I posted on our on LinkedIn a week or two ago a quote from a colonel, a retired Marine colonel, and he also teaches leadership at the Naval Academy, and he teaches the 3 C's of leadership: competence, courage, and compassion. And he says there's 3 questions that everybody in the organization is looking for their leader, up or down in the organization, to answer. Is the leader competent in what they do, or are they working really hard to learn their role? Does the leader have the courage to do what's right, even if it brings negative consequences on themselves? And does the leader care as much about me as he does himself, right? Those 3 questions are what everyone in the organization looks to their leader to answer. And really, that's what we try to do at Grief Leaders, right? Is we try to give leaders the competence to deal with this situation. We try to give them the courage to be vulnerable and engage. And we try to help them understand what it takes to have the same compassion for their people as they would for themselves or their spouse. And how to bring that all to work in a way that allows you to balance people first with mission always. So.
Got it. Amazing. How do people connect with you? I don't have your website on the ticker, so tell us how people can get in touch with you, Anthony.
Sure. So you certainly can reach out to us at griefleaders.com. And there's all kinds of information on our website, including how to order our book. And in particular, in the Contact Us section, you can either reach out to engage us or to schedule a complimentary consultation. But we'd really like to hear from people about their story, right? There's also a contact form that allows you to share your story, your return to work story. And those are most helpful and insightful to us. So we look forward to having folks fill out and tell us their story there in a private setting. And then, of course, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. So
awesome. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time. I'm very grateful that Bella introduced me to you. So I'm sure I'm going to be able to follow all the great work you're doing, and take good care of yourself, and happy holidays.
Well, you too. And thank you again for having me on the show and allowing us to share what we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.